All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on AO 2019-148, alcohol tax ballot proposition. Start with the introduction, starting on this side.
John Ballot.
Crystal Kennedy. Meg Zalatow.
Cameron Presbyterian. Forrest Dunbar.
Suzanne Zabrand.
Felix Rivera. We have Mr. Fred Dyson in the room. All right. So let's go ahead and start with
Also on the phone, Mr. Chair.
Yes, thank you. We have Mr. Chris Constant on the phone and Ms. Austin Quinn Davidson on the phone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start with the S1 version. Mr. Dunbar, do you want to go through that one?
Yeah, so are we sure it's the S1 and the S2?
Yeah,
They're
S1.
like a bunch of different. Okay. Great. Myself, Ms. Quinn Davidson, and Mr. Rivera have discussed the comments that were made at the last presentation on this and tried to incorporate several of them. So you should all have it in front of you, the S1 version of the alcohol tax. And I think it largely does what Ms. Zalatow and Ms. Perez-Verdier are asking for, which is try to combine some of the best ideas that we've got out there and produce a compromise document. So you can see where we've added language. On the second page, we have made some semantic changes. We've added detoxification and long-term addiction recovery facilities, which I think was highlighted in the S1 version, if I'm not wrong. Added the word prevent in there. We've added the 120-day reporting requirement, which came from the S1, the original S version, sorry. And then we've also, and this actually also came out of, there should be two things here. So the S version had the thing about not supplanting funding for existing services, so we put that in there too. And then, let me see, I guess it's not in here, but I'll just let you know that I intend to bring an amendment at the suggestion of the Budget Advisory Commission, it just didn't make it into this draft, that we actually set up a separate accounting fund for the funds raised by the alcohol tax. So we do that with some of our other...
It's section 3.
Oh, it is? I thought it wasn't.
It's bottom of page 2.
It's page 3. Oh, yeah, there it is. I'm sorry. So it did make it in here. Great. So on page 3, near the bottom, section 3, if the proposition is approved by the voters, the administration shall account for the revenues and expenditures of the tax base by a separate fund or account. As you know, we have dozens of funds, funding streams in the municipality. And this would set one up so it would be more transparent. So people know how much go in, and through the reporting mechanism, we know how much goes out. And then, of course, it doesn't change the fact that it is dedicated in the charter to just the things we've dedicated to. So that doesn't change. All right.
Great, thank you. Ms. Zalatow?
On page 3 with the dedication there, you've got funding for police and first responders and funding to combat and address child abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence.
Yep.
I'm a little bit worried about funding those things unless you're also contemplating it would mean funding some of the things, not necessarily exactly like Mr. Dyson has proposed, but the support for such things. If you have additional police and first responders, is that also that wouldn't include dispatch, that wouldn't include records. It also may not include municipal attorney's office, defense counsel. So I don't feel like we quite have a complete loop on that.
So this proposal in the funding for police and first responders, yes, it does include for any additional sworn officers, all of the extra stuff for them.
That's not clear.
Well, I don't know how you would make it clear in here, but if you have language suggested, then sure, feel free to. That's when we worked with the police chief and fire chief, we made sure that was clear. And then we also had talked about for non-sworn staff. The chief will decide what the biggest need is, and he's been very public that the biggest need right now is dispatch and evidence. And so that's the idea behind it.
So I think I see what you're saying, Ms. Zalatow, and if you have some additional language, I think we might welcome that. I think the problem with the original proposal with Mr. Dyson's proposal was it said compensation. It was a compensation for police officers, and that was a level of specificity that prevented support staff, whereas funding for police, I think we read that to be a little bit broader. But if you want to have a little bit, some more language, I'm fine with that. Do keep in mind, though, that like for prosecutors, for example, This is a significantly smaller chunk of funds than what Mr. Dyson is proposing. So I think we wanted to make it pretty specific, and we didn't want to add a bunch of other stuff in there. Now, prosecutors, yeah, I don't know. That's like on the line. It's much more. It's like I said, it's much more modest. I think with Mr. Dyson's proposal, you were thinking like 70 additional officers or something like that. You were thinking like 70 additional officers, I think, or 50 additional officers.
No, I didn't say.
Okay, but it's a lot more money. I mean, when we did our funding breakdown, we talked to the chiefs. They were talking about 6 additional officers.
If I may follow up really quick, but this goes into perpetuity. This doesn't sunset or end.
Yeah.
And so over the course of time, you could be adding a lot more officers and you wouldn't be able to use the tax revenues for that additional support that would be needed. So I just want us to be cognizant of that.
Thank you. Any other questions on this one before we go to Weddleton's? Zolotow's? Okay. All right. Which of you two wants to do it?
Oh, okay, thanks. We swapped some things around here. Let's say it looks quite a bit different. I think the thrust of it is the same, but if you look on page 2, B1, we moved, if you look at B, AA remains the same. B is mental health treatment facilities, and that was lower down, but really my intent had been that kind of facility to be something that was funded, but was only funded up to 50%. So we kind of really got it back on track. And we moved behavioral health and substance misuse prevention and response programs, which is something that I think the city could handle and do for our people. We are now, essentially, with your brother. We're not, but it's being done now. So we moved that down from that 50% split. We took abatement out. I mean, part of the intent is we want to stop having to do abatement. We want to provide the shelters for people and get down to the fundamental core issues, which is mental health and recovery. And if we do that, we won't have as much issue with the abatement. So instead of diluting that, plus we're already doing that. I mean, the intent here is to do new work with new money. Focus on that. Abatement's already taken care of. We did reports. And then G, if you look at page 3, line 20, we're working on this wording a little bit, but the intent is that any business that is subject to the alcohol retail tax would not have their alcohol tax, have the inventory tax on it. And if you're not aware, every retail and wholesale has to pay, basically your mill rate, 1.6% on whatever inventory you have on the shelf January 1st. So this relieves that. A lot of sales taxes, and I think Fred's, and I know Moira's had a credit for retailers who would, because basically retailers put in the position of collecting a city tax. So there's some compensation to balance that cost. So that's kind of one of the points with this. That's to kind of balance part of their cost, which is not only the physical cost of collecting the tax, but also kind of the market change that they may face, by essentially the 5% increase in the cost of their product. The estimate of that benefit, we got a really rough idea.
1 million.
Big part.
It's 1 million.
I think it was roughly 1 billion, but it's really hard to get that. When people, businesses that sell alcohol report their property tax or their inventory tax, it's everything they have in inventory, not just alcohol. So Jack Adamus looked at a number of businesses that only do package stores, and we got a rough estimate that it would be about $1 million. And that would not be lost revenue to the city, it just shifts to other taxpayers.
Thank you. Ms. Alto?
I just wanted to add 2 things about the changes in wordings and the dedication. The mental health treatment facilities, I know there's been a lot of talk about the possibility of a crisis stabilization center, so that would be potentially contemplated in there, and that would likely be a joint partnership with the state of Alaska. And then number 2, substance misuse prevention and response, we think it's expansive enough to include any additional support and expansion of the acreage safety control. So I just wanted to highlight those items.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that any of these proposals too, something that's important to know, and this came up in Gordon's discussion yesterday, is being a sales tax, this is an area-wide tax, so it can be spent in the whole variety of service areas that we have. Gerd was concerned, well, how do they get a piece of this? When you get into the police, that's a little trickier, but it would allow, I think Fred's version and even the basic version of the first version of the alcohol tax would allow the police to go in and do some of those things they can't do in Girdwood now, which would be, domestic violence and things like that. Anything listed there as a use of the tax could now be used in Girdwood, and that's important because Whittier can't do a lot of those things. Or they can't do them well compared to ABB.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
And that's really an excellent point, and you all made me think about that last night. The police force that they've hired, contracted, the Whittier guys, I don't want to be demeaning, but they're a little bit better than rental cops, building guards. But they can't do the investigative work and the detective work and all that sort of thing. They're, yeah. And so Girdwood, like all the rest of us, needs that. And that's a very good point you've raised.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
No, I was going to ask about the, I think you already answered this, about the personal property taxes. You said it's $1 million reduction in revenue you collect. Is that right?
No, it would shift $1 million essentially.
Right, which, I mean, we're trying to get additional revenue for the city, so it's $1 million less. The city will be...
No. When we did the personal property tax reduction or increase, that did a decrease recently. What last year was on the ballot here.
Oh, so you're saying that, interesting, so the residential property taxpayers would be paying more than, I mean, other property taxpayers would be paying a little bit more, because it's under
residential,
tax
commercial, whatever. And in terms of what we collect, it's relatively small.
That's interesting. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions on Whittleson's version? Sawtell's version? Any other final thoughts or comments? Yeah, Ms. Sawtell.
I want to thank all of my colleagues for this really great work, and I would just want to hope that regardless of what the outcome is of what goes on the ballot, that we sit down and we make space in our calendars to have an ongoing fiscal conversation. I think we need to have a much more comprehensive fiscal conversation in 2020 that probably leads into 2021. And can then be, if we could set the framework and then we can have it in the context of next year's budget discussion, I think it would be really helpful both for educating the public and ourselves, and then we can hopefully find some long-term sustainable path forward.
Thank you. Sure. Mr. Perez-Verdia, then Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, just some closing comments. I really, Mr. Chair, appreciated what you said in the previous session about the value of bringing different proposals to the table, and I agree with that. I think that's really a healthy process. The challenge, I think, moving forward is that I don't know if we have a process to make decisions that help us find something next. And I guess I'll just use a couple of examples. For instance, I don't know how many people, if we were to do a straw poll right now, would say, I absolutely will, I'm only going to go for an alcohol tax. Right? Absolutely, I'm only going to go for a sales tax. Because if 8 of us said alcohol tax only, then there's no reason to even start to pursue that, right? I mean, the sales tax. If we did a straw poll where we said, I mean, where are those non-negotiable pieces?
You're talking about amongst ourselves?
Amongst ourselves, that would allow us to even get a little closer to having a better conversation about where we should go from here. I don't have a sense of that. And I don't know if we have a forum for it, because I think what we continue to do is have conversations about the individual proposals, but not raising up the elements of each proposal and having a conversation about that. Where are we with that? And so I don't know if that would get us to a different place or not, but the lack of information about what everyone feels like is most valuable makes it difficult, at least for me, to have a sense of where to put my energy. Because coming up with 8 8 amendments on this proposal, and 9 amendments for this proposal, and 10 amendments for this proposal. So I've got 14 amendments that I'm going to bring forward, and he's got 12, and she's got 14. So this process, that's what I'm trying to figure out, is how to get us to a different place. And so I appreciate the process of bringing out all of these proposals and having work sessions for each one of them. But I have to say honestly that I'm struggling to figure out where to put my energy so that we can potentially, and the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is that, who are we really willing to put 3 proposals on the ballot? Are we willing to put 2 proposals? Well, you're shaking your head, but I don't know that. I don't know whether that's the viable option or not. So that's the challenge I face, is that we haven't had a work session where we've had some of those conversations that potentially would allow us to I think, come up with the best possible proposal. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, as usual, Cameron brings up a really good point. The founding fathers made us a constitutional republic, as opposed to a pure democracy. So that's because it's very difficult for the average citizen to keep himself informed enough to be able to make the tough decisions that are often unpopular. So then they elect us, the gray-haired, in my case, elders, or bald-headed elders of the tribe, but to study all the facts and make those decisions. We do not have, in general, a really well-informed population. I would suggest that whatever we go forward, we spend quite a few $1,000s getting a full page several times in the newspaper that explains just what the mayor's team pointed to us, put it out. What has happened to the city's, municipalities' income stream, totally out of our control, the challenges we've got, and so on and so forth. And we try to get the TV stations and so on. We put it all up on this muni's website so we get people informed about the city's fiscal condition and then what these proposals would do. Someone been around here a lot more than me said you guys ought to appropriate over $100K for the information campaign to get voters informed about what the issues are, what the options are, and what the do-nothing option does to us. I think that's real wisdom.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
I'm just responding to Cameron. So Cameron, you started last year. Because this is a better, more open discussion than we've had in like almost 4 years now. And I think
Progress.
So, I mean, your weaknesses you point out are very much there, but I think, Jason, whoever put together the example of 2% taxes and so on, that was very helpful. So we really started this way earlier than Bill Evans bringing out in late December. His sales tax, which I thought was a good one, I supported it, but, it was like right at the end. And this discussion has been very long, I think, with the clear vision of where the state's heading. It's prompted that. And then I think the opportunity of this recovery center, the $15 million and so on, it's really brought us to a different point. But this is really a good example compared to my experience. Well, it could be better, but
I'm not sure there's a clear vision where the state is heading.
Thank you. Mr. Gates, you wanted to say something?
I would just want to also respond to Mr. Perez-Verdi's comment about the process. And with these proposals, we had an ordinances introduced and then a flurry of changes and amendments. And that's, I think, what you say you're trying to figure out. A more efficient process. Sometimes it just depends on what the legislation is and the timing and the deadlines we have. But we've seen some other ordinances that I've drafted when you have a small work group draft an initial draft and then a committee take a couple of meetings to go through and give feedback and make changes, and then it gets to introduced as an ordinance. That's where you see a lot fewer amendments, and it's a lot more collaborative when you've done that kind of committee or work group effort in advance of introducing something. So, but you can't do that all the time.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess comment from me, and then we can wrap it up. And Mr. Weddleton mentioned it. So in October, we started this discussion around new revenues. The administration did a really great job of presenting 4 different revenue options plus their community dividend model. They talked about a bed tax, they talked about an alcohol tax, a sales tax, and a payroll tax. And at that time, I tried to get a gauge of the members of how we wanted to move forward. And the gauge that I received was a sales tax and a payroll tax sound complicated. They sound like things that might take that would take a long time for us to coalesce around, and would probably take even longer for the public to coalesce around. A bed tax and an alcohol tax, not as complicated, and have been ideas introduced to the public in the past, in the recent past. So I think from that October work session, several of us got the clear idea of how we wanted to move forward, and then, of course, the conversations evolved from there. But I do agree, Mr. Presverdia, that finding out ways where we can coalesce in the future on how we want to move forward. I think that there are ways that we can do that, and I look forward to exploring that. With that,
Wait, can I have one last comment?
Sure.
I would just say that our S1 version, I think, is we're trying to do some of the things you said. I mean, we had a public safety meeting regarding it, and I think another work session too. We took a bunch of comments and we put them in the draft. I mean, this draft is very changed by the process that has already happened in the at this body, as is Fred's. Fred's proposal, I really appreciate how much you changed dedication language based on the feedback that we had. So yeah, I mean, at least in our alcohol tax proposal and the sales tax proposal, I think you can see the impact of other people's comments on what we're doing and that process that we're talking about.
Yeah, and let me just respond to that real quick and say that I agree. I mean, I hope my comments don't come across as I mean, I guess they do come across as critical of the process, but it's more hopeful about what else we can do. And I would just say that I mean, partly I would really love to be able to focus my brain a little bit. I mean, I would love to know if there's not an appetite in this body to pass a sales tax right now. I'd just love to know that so that I can stop working on my brain on that and go, okay, then let's try to make the alcohol tax the best we could do. And let's try to bring some ideas that maybe there's some property tax relief. Maybe there's a sunset mechanism. Maybe there's a shift in terms of what it funds. So, I mean, you know, that's what I'm trying to figure out in my brain, because at this point I don't have that, and I'm not sure we will until we start voting.
Right.
And so that's what I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I'd like to make some progress even beyond what we've already done.
and I think inherently it's part of the legislative process that some people don't want to answer those questions.
Sure.
And
Sure.
others are happy to answer, right?
No,
So-
I appreciate
Chair.
that
Yeah.
and respect that.
Yeah.
And I think the process is going very well generally, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thanks. After our meeting that I was able to attend on Tuesday, one of the most strident advocates for the alcohol tax essentially said, if you haven't raised $175,000 in an advocacy campaign, don't even do this. Just, reiterate that that's the message that's coming from even the most strident advocates.
Thank you. All right, with that, I'll close this work session and thank everyone for a fantastic and very busy first week back. I promise this isn't going to be the new normal.